On July 18, 1920, a single gunshot echoed through a residence in Potsdam. The man who fell was not a nameless soldier, but Prince Joachim of Prussia, the youngest son of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Born into privilege, raised under the iron discipline of empire, he carried the weight of a dynasty on his shoulders. Yet in the wreckage of Germany's defeat, he crumbled into despair. At just 29, Joachim chose to end his life, leaving behind a haunting question: why would a prince with everything die in utter loneliness? Prince Joachim Franz Humbert of Prussia entered the world on December 17, 1890, in the grand surroundings of Potsdam, a city that had long been synonymous with Prussian kingship and military splendor. He was the sixth and youngest son of Kaiser Wilhelm II. And from the very beginning, his life was defined less by personal choice than by the heavy architecture of dynasty. Every stone of the palaces that surrounded him whispered of conquest, discipline, and destiny. Joachim was not simply a child. He was an heir to centuries of militarized tradition. Growing up in the Hohenzollern family meant inhabiting a world where marble floors echoed with the footsteps of guards, where portraits of armored ancestors lined the halls, and where expectations hung heavier than the chandeliers. Joachim's father, Wilhelm II, was not only a monarch, but the living embodiment of imperial ambition. He ruled a vast empire with a voice that thundered in parliament and echoed across European diplomacy. To be the son of such a man was both a privilege and a suffocating burden. For the young prince, childhood was not about play in gardens or innocent laughter. It was about early lessons in posture, etiquette, and the invisible performance of authority. His tutors drilled him in history, languages, and above all, the glory of Prussia's military heritage. Unlike some of his brothers, who leaned toward artistic or intellectual pursuits, Joachim was molded directly into the image of a soldier. He was given toy soldiers not merely for amusement, but as training tools, small figurines representing the discipline and order expected of him in real life. There was little room for fragility. The Prussian ethos, obedience, toughness, and silence, demanded that even the youngest son of the emperor suppress weakness. Joachim learned early that tears were shameful, that hesitation was dangerous, and that loyalty to the empire was not optional, but instinctive. His tutors, officers, and even his own parents reminded him that his life belonged not to himself, but to the dynasty. Yet Joachim was not destined to inherit the throne. As the youngest, his role was less defined, his place in the grand chessboard of dynastic succession uncertain. His eldest brother, Crown Prince Wilhelm, carried the burden of direct succession, while others were slotted into military or diplomatic posts. Joachim, by contrast, hovered at the edges, still important, still visible, but without a clear path of power. This uncertainty would haunt him later as the empire crumbled. For now, however, he remained the boy in uniform, the prince who smiled in official photographs, standing a step behind his towering father. The environment of Potsdam in which Joachim was raised was steeped in martial imagery. The city itself was dotted with barracks, parade grounds, and monuments to past victories. Festivals and parades were not simply entertainment. They were rituals of loyalty to the empire. As a child, Joachim watched soldiers march in perfect step, their bayonets gleaming under the sun, their boots striking the cobblestones like a drumbeat of eternity. He absorbed this rhythm into his blood, for this was the heartbeat of his world. Behind this grandeur, however, Joachim's personal life was quieter, almost muted. Accounts from family members suggest that he was more sensitive than his father, more prone to introspection than outward bravado. Unlike Wilhelm II, who reveled in displays of strength and grand speeches, Joachim carried a certain reserve. Some historians later speculated that his temperament made him ill-suited for the relentless expectations of Prussian royalty. He could imitate the discipline, but the fire of confidence did not come naturally to him. Still, as a boy, he remained obedient, bending under the weight of expectation without yet breaking. He learned to ride horses with rigid posture, to salute with precision, to memorize the genealogies of European courts. Each act was less about self-expression and more about becoming a symbol, a living emblem of Hohenzollern continuity. The outbreak of the 20th century brought with it both promise and foreboding. Industrialization surged, cities expanded, and Germany projected itself as a modern empire under Wilhelm II's restless vision. But in the private world of Joachim, the century began much as it always had, with lessons, drills, and the awareness that his name and blood bound him to a destiny greater than his individual desires. Perhaps the most striking element of Joachim's youth was its contrast to the world outside the palace walls. While the empire brimmed with new ideas, socialism, workers' movements, scientific revolutions, Joachim remained enclosed in the fortress of tradition. He was raised to believe in the permanence of monarchy, the inevitability of Prussian dominance, and the sanctity of loyalty. That his life would later be swept away by precisely the collapse of those illusions gives his childhood an air of tragic irony. By the time Joachim reached adolescence, the outlines of his personality were visible. He was dutiful, respectful, but also quieter, more fragile than the public facade suggested. He did not radiate the charisma of his father, nor the flamboyance of some of his elder brothers. Instead, he seemed almost caught between two worlds, the expectations of a dynasty and the whisper of a more private, uncertain self. In family gatherings, he often faded into the background, his presence overshadowed by louder voices and more dominant personalities. To outsiders, this might have seemed inconsequential, the natural position of a younger son. But to Joachim, it planted the seed of insignificance, the subtle wound of being necessary yet not essential. And yet, despite these shadows, there remained in him a quiet dignity. The boy who walked the corridors of Potsdam's palaces, who listened to the footsteps of soldiers and the lectures of tutors, was still a prince. He still embodied the weight of history. Every bow of a servant, every salute from a soldier, every respectful whisper of "Your Highness" reinforced the illusion of permanence. No one could have imagined that within 3 decades, those same palaces would fall silent, that the empire itself would vanish, and that Joachim's life, so carefully structured, so rigidly disciplined, would collapse in despair. For now, he was simply the youngest son of the empire, a figure molded by grandeur, yet unknowingly destined to become its casualty. From the very first days of his boyhood, Prince Joachim's path was sketched in military ink. Unlike some royal children who might have been given space to explore music, art, or the sciences, Joachim's life was pressed firmly into the mold of a soldier. It was not simply a suggestion. It was the very architecture of his upbringing. In the Hohenzollern household, the empire itself was the family's true firstborn. Every son, whether destined for the throne or not, was trained as a servant to its permanence. By the time Joachim was old enough to button a coat, he was dressed in miniature uniforms. Portraits survive of the young prince in crisp tunics, polished boots, and tiny epaulettes, his serious gaze already rehearsing the sternness expected of a future officer. Childhood games were military parades in miniature, wooden rifles, toy cannons, and elaborate drills orchestrated by tutors and guardians. The palace courtyards that might have been gardens for play instead echoed with the rhythm of marching feet. The military shadow that hung over Joachim was not an impersonal institution. It was embodied in his father, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Wilhelm's obsession with uniforms and parades bordered on the theatrical. He delighted in the pageantry of soldiers, the gleam of medals, the clashing of sabers. To his sons, he was less a father in the domestic sense than a supreme commander. Love was rarely expressed in warmth or tenderness, but rather in demands for discipline, posture, and loyalty. For Joachim, the youngest son, these expectations fell with particular weight. If he could not shine as heir apparent, he could at least embody the military ideal. As a teenager, Joachim was enrolled in military academies, institutions designed not to nurture individuality, but to stamp out weakness. His days were consumed by drills, inspections, and lessons in the technical art of war. He studied maps, strategy, and the history of Prussia's victories. The walls of his classrooms carried portraits of Frederick the Great, stern reminders that greatness came only through discipline and sacrifice. There was no space in these rooms for hesitation, doubt, or vulnerability. The ethos drilled into him was simple and merciless. To be a Hohenzollern was to be steel. Pain was weakness, hesitation was betrayal. And the highest form of love one could show the fatherland was obedience unto death. This martial education shaped Joachim's outer shell, but within, the tension was already beginning to build. Sensitive by nature, he adapted to the iron mold, but did not entirely fit it. He learned to march, but his steps were heavy. He learned to salute, but the gesture never carried the same fire as it did in his father's hand. The world of barracks and parades also created a strange isolation for Joachim. Friendships among cadets were possible but shallow, restrained by the constant surveillance of instructors and the ever-present demand for toughness. Affection, laughter, and weakness were treated with suspicion. He learned to speak less, to conceal his moods, to harden his expression even when his heart recoiled. This concealment, so central to his survival as a young soldier prince, would later become one of the cruelest prisons of his adulthood. An inability to reveal the depth of his suffering until it was too late. The rituals of his youth followed him into his late teens. He appeared at public ceremonies in polished uniforms, standing rigid beside his father, saluting as regiments marched past. Newspapers described him as promising, dutiful, a loyal son of the empire. To the public eye, Joachim was everything a young Hohenzollern should be: quiet, disciplined, respectable. But within the palace walls, family members noticed the cracks. He was prone to silences, easily shaken by his father's sharp temper, and overshadowed by brothers whose personalities were louder, brasher, more naturally aligned with the Prussian mythos. It is perhaps no surprise, then, that Joachim never developed the confidence of a natural leader. He became, instead, a follower, always in uniform, always present, yet never quite the center. This role, though seemingly harmless in youth, planted seeds of fragility. He was being trained for obedience in a world that soon would demand adaptability, resilience, and the ability to redefine oneself when the old order collapsed. Yet even in this shadow, there were moments that revealed his humanity. Some accounts suggest that Joachim had a gentler side, drawn to literature and private reflection when duty allowed. He enjoyed moments of quiet reading, away from the drills and inspections. There are hints that he was more capable of empathy than some of his brothers, a quality that, in the cutthroat world of military dynasties, was not seen as a strength, but as a liability. The paradox of Joachim's youth is this: he was trained relentlessly to embody an empire that would not survive his adulthood. His entire identity was woven into the banners of Prussian militarism, the iron discipline of the barracks, and the rituals of obedience. And yet, history would soon sweep all of it away. The very tools that shaped him, silence, obedience, inflexibility, would leave him unprepared for the chaos that followed the Great War. By the time Joachim reached his 20s, he was firmly cast in the image of a soldier prince. He wore the uniform not just as clothing, but as skin. Every stitch, every medal, every parade reinforced the illusion of permanence. The youngest son of Wilhelm II stood beneath the vast shadow of the German army. His life molded into its shape. But shadows, however vast, cannot endure once the light shifts. And when it shifted, Joachim would discover that the steel armor forged in youth could not protect him from the collapse of the world he had been raised to serve. When the summer of 1914 erupted into war, Prince Joachim of Prussia was 23 years old, an age when men might dream of freedom, love, or discovery. For Joachim, those possibilities vanished beneath the shadow of mobilization. Germany marched to war with drums and banners, and he, like every Hohenzollern son, was expected to stand at the front, a living emblem of imperial duty. For Joachim, the war was not a choice, it was destiny. The culmination of the years he had spent in stiff uniforms, drilled into obedience. The empire that had shaped his identity now demanded payment. He took his place among the soldiers, a prince in uniform, but also a man stepping into a storm that would leave no one untouched. The early days were cloaked in illusion. Across Berlin and Potsdam, crowds cheered, flowers were thrown, and newspapers spoke of quick victory. Joachim rode at the head of regiments, cheered not for his personal valor, but for the dynasty he represented. To the public eye, he was a symbol of confidence, the Kaiser's son marching into history. But war, once stripped of ceremony, revealed its true face. The mud of Flanders and the smoke of the Western Front cared nothing for royal blood. The clash of artillery, the sight of soldiers torn apart, the endless funerals, these were the daily bread of Joachim's military service. He witnessed not the glory promised in speeches, but the brutal arithmetic of modern slaughter. Accounts suggest that Joachim served with sincerity, carrying out his duties without complaint. Yet the experience left deep marks. He saw firsthand the collapse of illusions, the gulf between parade ground discipline and battlefield chaos. The empire's myth of invincibility dissolved in the trenches. Soldiers who had once marched proudly now clung to survival, their faith in the monarchy cracking with every bombardment. For Joachim, this was more than disillusionment. It was a tearing away of the very foundation of his identity. He had been raised to believe in the permanence of dynasty, the sacredness of loyalty, the inevitability of Prussian dominance. But on the front lines, permanence became fragility. The empire that had seemed eternal was bleeding out in the mud. Worse still, he was not a commander shaping destiny, but a junior officer adrift in a machinery too vast for individual influence. His presence was symbolic, but symbolism gave no shelter against the despair of soldiers who muttered about hunger, death, and betrayal. Joachim, despite his uniform and title, was just another man trapped in the storm. As the years dragged on, the weight deepened. By 1917, Germany's hopes of swift victory had withered. Blockades starved the home front, soldiers mutinied, and whispers of revolution grew louder. Joachim, who had once embodied loyalty, now watched as loyalty itself evaporated. He carried within him the double burden of soldier and prince, the horror of war itself, and the realization that the dynasty to which he belonged was becoming a relic. For the sensitive young man who had struggled to fit into the armor of discipline, the dissonance was devastating. He had done everything expected of him, worn the uniform, marched into battle, saluted the flag, and yet the flag was falling. Faith, drilled into him since boyhood, cracked under the weight of defeat. In letters and later accounts, Joachim appeared increasingly restless, torn between duty and despair. He could not articulate his turmoil openly. To do so would have been treason to his family and cowardice in the eyes of the army. Instead, he carried it silently, as he had carried so many expectations before. The silence, however, grew heavy, pressing inward until it became almost unbearable. By the autumn of 1918, the empire itself was collapsing. Revolution swept through Germany, the Kaiser fled to Holland, and Joachim returned not to victory, but to a shattered homeland. The war had promised him meaning, but it delivered only ghosts. His faith in empire, father, and destiny was left in ruins. The tragedy of Joachim's war years lies not only in the carnage he witnessed, but in what the war destroyed within him. He had entered the conflict as the youngest son of an empire, armored in the illusion of permanence. He emerged stripped of that armor, carrying only disillusionment and an emptiness that no title could fill. History would soon describe him as a casualty of depression, a man broken by personal loss. But the first fracture occurred here, in the trenches of the Great War. It was here that Joachim's belief in the world he had been trained to serve dissolved, leaving behind only the shadows of shattered faith. The fall of 1918 was not just the end of a war. It was the death of a world. For Prince Joachim of Prussia, the empire into which he had been born, the empire that had shaped his very blood and bone, dissolved almost overnight. One morning, he was still a royal son of the Kaiser, cloaked in centuries of prestige. By evening, he was merely another German citizen, stripped of the crown's protections and the dynasty's authority. On November 9th, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled across the border to Holland. For his sons, the act was more than political. It was existential. The monarchy had been their reason for being, their justification for discipline, their armor against uncertainty. Without it, what were they? Joachim, the youngest, felt this void with particular cruelty. He had never stood at the center of power, never been groomed for a throne, but always lived in its shadow. Now even that shadow was gone. The Hohenzollern palaces, once buzzing with ministers, servants, and parades, grew silent. Joachim returned to Potsdam, not as a prince of destiny, but as a dispossessed man. The Weimar Republic that replaced the monarchy viewed figures like him with suspicion, as relics of a past the new order sought to bury. Where once his title had opened doors, it now closed them. Where once his name inspired deference, it now provoked bitterness. For Joachim, the transformation was humiliating. He was a man trained for a role that no longer existed, a soldier without an army, a prince without a throne. His brothers sought exile or attempted to carve new lives abroad, but Joachim remained behind, caught between two identities, too royal for the Republic, too powerless for monarchy. Financial ruin deepened the humiliation. The war and abdication had drained the Hohenzollern fortunes. Joachim, who had grown up surrounded by wealth, found himself burdened by debt. His marriage to Princess Marie Auguste of Anhalt, once celebrated as a dynastic union, was strained by the collapse of financial stability. They had a child, Karl Franz, who briefly offered hope for continuity. But even fatherhood could not shield Joachim from the gnawing realization that he had no role left to play. What tormented him most was not simply the loss of privilege, but the loss of identity. He had been raised as a soldier prince, taught to embody the permanence of empire. Now, in the raw light of the Republic, he was just Joachim, a man with no profession, no authority, and no purpose. Unlike soldiers who returned from war to resume trades or farms, he had no fallback. His entire training had been for a monarchy that no longer existed. The German press did not spare him. Newspapers, eager to celebrate the Republic and mock the old order, painted the former princes as parasites, clinging to titles that meant nothing. Satirical cartoons depicted them as useless aristocrats, drowning in irrelevance. For Joachim, already fragile, these public humiliations were wounds cut deeper than any battlefield injury. His very existence became a spectacle of decline. Those who knew him described a growing restlessness. He wandered between residences, unable to anchor himself. Friends reported him as brooding, irritable, quick to anger, yet often withdrawn into silence. His brothers, busy saving themselves, offered little support. His father, the exiled Kaiser in Holland, remained a distant figure, preoccupied with his own bitterness and denial. Joachim stood alone, the youngest son abandoned by both dynasty and destiny. There is a cruel irony here. For all his life, Joachim had been trained in obedience, in silence, in suppressing weakness. Now, when he most needed resilience, those very habits betrayed him. He could not adapt, could not redefine himself, could not speak his despair. The discipline that had once been his armor became his chain. The Republic's society, meanwhile, offered no place for him. Nobles who reinvented themselves as businessmen, artists, or adventurers at least found a path forward. Joachim could not. His pride, his fragile temperament, and his lack of preparation made reinvention impossible. He was too royal to become ordinary, too broken to remain royal. The dispossession was not only political or financial, it was deeply personal. Joachim's marriage, already strained, began to falter under the weight of humiliation. His wife saw in him not a strong prince, but a defeated man. Their relationship, once meant to symbolize dynastic continuity, became another stage on which Joachim's decline played out. By 1919, the full tragedy was clear. Joachim was not merely a man living in a republic. He was a man erased by it. His very name, once a banner, had become an anachronism. His life was the embodiment of a dynasty's collapse, a reminder that even princes could be rendered useless by history's turn. For the sensitive, uncertain boy who had once stood in miniature uniforms, watching soldiers march across Potsdam, the contrast was unbearable. He had dreamed, perhaps not of glory, but at least of meaning. Now even that was gone. He was the youngest son of a fallen empire, left standing amid ruins, dispossessed in every sense of the word. The stage was set for the next act of his tragedy, a marriage unraveling, a mind descending, and a life inching toward the silence of a single gunshot. In 1916, while war still thundered across Europe, Prince Joachim of Prussia stood in a chapel and took a bride. The marriage to Princess Marie Auguste of Anhalt was presented to the world as a moment of dynastic stability. Newspapers of the time carried photographs of the smiling couple, framed by uniforms and gowns, as though the empire itself were reaffirming its continuity. For Joachim, who was then 26, the union offered not just companionship, but the illusion of certainty in a world already beginning to tremble. Marie Auguste was young, elegant, and from a house of respectable lineage. To the public, she seemed the perfect match. A woman who could soften Joachim's serious demeanor and provide heirs for the dynasty. For the Hohenzollern family, the marriage was another thread in the intricate web of alliances that bound Europe's royal houses together. It was political, ceremonial, and deeply symbolic. Yet beneath the pageantry, the marriage was fragile from the beginning. The war cast its long shadow even over their wedding vows. While candles flickered and guests whispered of romance, outside the chapel soldiers marched to uncertain fates. The couple's first years together were marked not by domestic calm, but by absence, as Joachim's military service kept him away for long stretches. Letters replaced conversations, and photographs substituted for presence. The early bond of intimacy was tested by separation before it had the chance to grow strong. When Joachim returned from the front lines, he was not the man Marie-Auguste had married. The war had carved lines into his face and shadows into his spirit. He had seen death too closely, carried too much disillusionment. Sensitive by nature, he struggled to mask the turbulence inside. His wife, raised in privilege but untested by the brutality of war, found herself confronted with a husband she could neither fully understand nor heal. Still, for a time, appearances held. In 1916, Marie-Auguste gave birth to their son, Karl Franz. For Joachim, the child was a flicker of hope, a reminder that even amid chaos, continuity was possible. He held the infant with tenderness, perhaps glimpsing in fatherhood the purpose that had otherwise eluded him. Photographs show him with the boy in his arms, the rare hint of softness breaking through the sternness drilled into him since childhood. But hope is fragile, and the collapse of 1918 shattered what little stability the marriage had built. When the monarchy fell, Joachim lost not only his position, but the very scaffolding of his identity. The humiliation of dispossession seeped into every aspect of his life, including his marriage. Financial difficulties strained the household, debts mounted, and the luxuries that had once surrounded them vanished. More corrosive still was the change in Joachim himself. Depression began to shadow him, manifesting in bursts of anger, restless moods, and long silences. Marie-Auguste, still in her 20s, found herself living with a man increasingly consumed by inner turmoil. Where once there might have been tenderness, now there was distance. She could not reach him through the wall of despair that grew taller each day. Contemporaries described Joachim as erratic during these years, prone to sudden flashes of temper followed by periods of withdrawal. He oscillated between attempts to assert dignity and collapses into despondency. For a woman raised in the expectation of royal composure, this instability was more than troubling. It was intolerable. The marriage, which had begun as a carefully arranged symbol of dynastic promise, now became another arena of decline. Publicly, Joachim and Marie-Auguste maintained appearances, attending social events, presenting themselves as a couple. Privately, their bond frayed. Conversations turned into arguments, arguments into silences. The shared vision of a future together dissolved under the pressure of failure. It is tempting, with hindsight, to see inevitability in this unraveling. Joachim, already fragile, could not bear the combined weight of political dispossession and personal disappointment. Marie-Auguste, young and ambitious in her own right, could not bind her fate to a man sinking into despair. Their marriage, once hailed as a union of strength, revealed itself as a bond of glass, beautiful under light, but quick to shatter under strain. And yet, in its fragility, the marriage humanized Joachim. Behind the uniform and the title, he was not simply a soldier prince, but a man desperate for love, companionship, and stability. He longed for reassurance, for the sense that he still mattered, still belonged to something enduring. But the very institution that had defined him, monarchy, was gone. Without it, he clung to his marriage as a substitute anchor. When it too began to fail, his descent quickened. By 1919, those around the couple whispered of irreparable rifts. Marie Auguste grew increasingly distant, while Joachim's depression deepened. The presence of their child, rather than healing the marriage, became another reminder of the future Joachim feared he could not provide. He saw in Karl Franz both hope and reproach. Hope for a legacy, reproach for a father too broken to secure it. Thus, what began as a celebrated union ended as a portrait of fragility. Joachim's marriage, like his empire, had been built on illusion. The illusion of permanence, of strength, of control. When those illusions dissolved, nothing remained to hold the pieces together. The stage was now set for humiliation even deeper than dispossession. Divorce. In a society that still prized appearances, for a former prince to be abandoned by his wife was not merely personal tragedy. It was public disgrace. And for Joachim, already drowning in despair, it would become the next and most bitter wound. By 1920, Prince Joachim of Prussia had lost almost everything that once defined him. The empire was gone, his father was in exile, his fortune diminished, his role erased. Yet even these losses were not the final blow. The deepest cut came from the collapse of his marriage. A wound that was both personal and public, both intimate and humiliating. In February of that year, Marie Auguste of Anhalt filed for divorce. The act, simple in its legality, carried devastating symbolism. In a society that still viewed marriage as sacred, for a wife to abandon her husband was scandal enough. But for a princess to leave a Hohenzollern, and for that husband to be the Kaiser's son, was something close to unthinkable. Newspapers seized upon the news with relish. Satirical articles mocked the fallen prince whose wife had cast him aside. For Joachim, already fragile, the divorce was not just rejection by a woman, but rejection by society itself. He had married in 1916 under the glow of dynastic optimism, believing in permanence. 4 years later, the permanence was dust. The empire had dissolved, and now his household followed suit. Friends and relatives whispered of his instability, his moods, his inability to adapt. Some portrayed Marie Auguste as a victim, trapped in a marriage to a man consumed by bitterness and despair. Others sympathized with Joachim, seeing in the divorce another injustice heaped upon a man already broken. What mattered most, however, was how Joachim saw it. For him, it was humiliation on every level. To lose his wife was to lose the last anchor of dignity he still clung to. To see it reported in the press was to have his failure laid bare before the world. He, the son of an emperor, was reduced to the status of an ordinary man, abandoned and pitied. The shame gnawed at him more viciously than death or exile ever could. Humiliation fed his despair. Those who encountered him in these months described a man oscillating between bursts of anger and long silences. He walked with the stiffness of a soldier, but without its confidence, as though every step were a performance for an audience that no longer cared. His eyes, once steady, seemed restless, darting, as though searching for something already lost. The financial pressure compounded his torment. Without the monarchy's resources, Joachim struggled to support himself. Lawsuits over property, disputes over inheritance, and constant debt collectors turned his daily life into a battlefield of humiliation. Every reminder of his dispossession, bills unpaid, servants dismissed, estates lost, was another insult to his pride. He had been trained to command. Now he was commanded by circumstance. The divorce also fractured his relationship with his young son, Karl Franz. Though Joachim loved the boy, Custody disputes and the bitterness of separation created distance. He feared becoming irrelevant not only in politics, but in his own child's life. For a man whose entire identity had already been stripped away, the prospect of losing his role as father was unbearable. Observers began to describe him in medical terms. Melancholia, they said, the word used then for severe depression. Some suspected the lingering effects of war trauma. Others whispered of a hereditary curse, pointing to mental fragility within royal bloodlines. Modern historians have speculated that he may have suffered from bipolar disorder or post-traumatic stress. Whatever the diagnosis, the reality was clear. Joachim was unraveling. Humiliation often acts like acid, burning not in sudden bursts, but in slow corrosion. For Joachim, every reminder of what he had been, photographs of his wedding, uniforms from his youth, even the sound of military bands, became painful echoes. He was no longer the prince on parade, no longer the dutiful soldier, no longer the husband in photographs. He was a man stripped bare, mocked by his own memories. In exile in Holland, his father Wilhelm II raged at the Republic and wrote bitter letters about betrayal. But even the Kaiser, consumed by his own grievances, offered little comfort to his son. Joachim's siblings, each absorbed in their own survival, kept their distance. Isolation grew. The youngest son, once surrounded by tutors, servants, and family, now found himself profoundly alone. The humiliation of divorce was not just private heartbreak, it was public spectacle. Society that once bowed now sneered. Joachim became the object of pity, and pity to him was the cruelest insult of all. He had been raised in a world where honor was sacred, where weakness was shameful, where failure was unforgivable. To live as the butt of satire and the subject of whispered gossip was more than he could bear. The irony is that Joachim's tragedy was not a single catastrophic event, but a series of small, relentless humiliations. Each chipped away at him. The abdication, the loss of wealth, the public ridicule, the divorce. Individually, perhaps, they could have been endured. Together, they formed a cage of despair. By mid-1920, those who saw him sensed the darkness closing in. He spoke less, smiled rarely, and carried himself with the brittle dignity of a man performing a role he no longer believed in. The collapse of his marriage had not only stripped him of love, it had stripped him of the illusion that anything in his life was stable. The final act was drawing near. Soon, the silence of despair would break with the sound of a single gunshot in Potsdam. But before that, Joachim lived through months of humiliation. Each day another reminder that he was not the prince he had been raised to be, but a man left naked before history's cruel gaze. By the summer of 1920, Prince Joachim of Prussia was only 29 years old, yet he carried the weight of a man who had lived a lifetime of defeats. Those closest to him began to describe him in clinical terms. Melancholia, the old word for deep, paralyzing depression. It was more than sadness. It was a suffocating fog that clung to him from morning to night, clouding every thought and draining every ounce of will. The signs had been visible for years. After the war, Joachim grew restless, unable to sit still, unable to find purpose. At times he erupted in anger, sudden bursts of temper that startled those around him. At other times, he retreated into silence, staring at walls, lost in thoughts no one could reach. This instability frightened his wife, then alienated his friends, and eventually isolated him entirely. What others saw as mood swings, historians today might recognize as symptoms of bipolar disorder or post-traumatic stress. But in 1920, Such diagnoses were distant whispers. What people saw was a man unraveling. Depression has many faces, but in Joachim, it wore the mask of fatigue. He seemed constantly exhausted, dragging his body through daily routines with little energy. His once proud posture sagged, his eyes dulled, his words came slower. For a man raised in an empire of iron discipline, this collapse of physical presence was humiliating. He had been trained to march, to salute, to embody strength. Now he could barely summon the energy to rise from bed. Those around him urged treatment, but medicine for the mind was primitive. Doctors prescribed rest, fresh air, and distraction, remedies that did little for a soul drowning in despair. Some suggested he should travel, seek new surroundings, or take up new work. But Joachim, bound by pride and inertia, resisted. His world had already collapsed. He could not imagine rebuilding it elsewhere. The war lingered in him like a ghost. He had seen too much blood, too much disillusionment, too much betrayal of the ideals he had been taught since childhood. Nightmares haunted him, sudden flashes of memory that jolted him awake in the dark. In quiet moments, he muttered of comrades lost, of the empire's humiliation, of the emptiness that followed. Depression fed on these memories, tightening its grip until even daylight offered no relief. Financial ruin sharpened the blade. Debts piled higher, creditors pressed harder, and possessions slipped away one by one. For a man once surrounded by opulence, the decline into austerity was unbearable. Each loss reminded him of what he had been and what he no longer was. Every unpaid bill was an insult, every confiscated asset a humiliation. He began to see himself not as a prince enduring misfortune, but as a failure unworthy of his own name. His divorce only deepened the spiral. The absence of his wife was a daily ache. The distance from his child, a wound that never closed. He longed for reconciliation, for a family restored, but the prospect grew ever more remote. Instead, he brooded on betrayal, imagining slights, reliving arguments, rehearsing grievances. In solitude, resentment festered into despair. What made Joachim's depression so destructive was its inescapability. He had been raised to believe that strength was a choice, that weakness was shameful. Thus, when despair consumed him, he blamed himself. He saw his illness not as an affliction, but as failure. Rather than seek comfort, he hid his pain. Rather than share his fears, he buried them deeper. Each day became a performance of dignity, while inside he crumbled. The Republic outside offered no solace. Germany in 1920 was a nation racked by instability, uprisings, assassinations, economic crisis. For the former prince, this chaos mirrored his own inner disintegration. He saw no future for himself in the Republic's noisy streets and shifting governments. He was, in every sense, a man without a country. Witnesses later described him as pacing restlessly through the rooms of his residence, muttering under his breath, his face pale, his eyes hollow. Servants reported hearing him slam doors, then sit for hours in silence. He avoided gatherings, avoided conversation, avoided mirrors. When he did speak, it was often of hopelessness. "There is nothing left," he was heard to say. Nothing. The tragedy of Joachim's depression was not only its depth, but its invisibility. In photographs from this period, he still appears composed, dressed formally, his mustache trimmed, his posture straight. But the mask concealed a crumbling core. The world saw a former prince clinging to dignity. Inside, he was already slipping away. Historians have called him a casualty of transition, a man unable to adapt from empire to republic. Yet that phrase flattens the reality. Joachim was not merely unable, he was crushed. The training of his youth, the rigidity of Prussian discipline, the silence demanded of princes, all combined to make adaptation impossible. He had been forged to serve a monarchy. When the monarchy vanished, he was left with nothing but despair. By July 1920, his depression had reached a point of no return. Those who encountered him sensed the finality, the heaviness in his tone, the despair in his eyes. He was no longer speaking of recovery, no longer imagining a future. He carried himself like a man rehearsing an ending, and soon that rehearsal would give way to reality. A gun waited in the next room, and with it, the silence he believed was his only escape. The morning of July 18, 1920, dawned quietly in Potsdam. The air was warm, the sky pale with summer light, and the city stirred with the sounds of ordinary life, church bells, footsteps on cobblestones, the distant hum of trains. But inside one residence, silence had already taken root, thick and suffocating. Prince Joachim of Prussia, the youngest son of Kaiser Wilhelm II, rose from his bed with the weight of despair pressing down like armor he could no longer remove. When the days leading up to this morning, his moods had grown darker, his silences longer, servants reported that he had barely spoken, pacing the halls at night, stopping at windows as though searching for something he could not name. To those who saw him, his eyes seemed hollow, his movements mechanical. Depression had long been his companion, but now it had hardened into something heavier, more final. That morning, Joachim dressed with care. He put on a uniform, though the empire it symbolized no longer existed. The act was ritual, a desperate attempt to summon dignity from the fragments of a vanished world. Perhaps he believed that, in uniform, he could leave life the way he had been trained to live it, as a soldier, not as a broken man. Accounts differ on the exact sequence of events, but all agree on the ending. Sometime late in the morning, Joachim entered a private room. In his hand was a pistol, the same kind of weapon that had once represented authority, order, and the defense of empire. Now it had become an instrument of silence. He lifted it, placed it to his head, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot shattered the quiet. Servants rushed to the room, their footsteps echoing against the palace walls. What they found was not the confident young prince of parades and ceremonies, but a man lying motionless, his life slipping away in crimson stillness. Yet even then, death did not come instantly. The bullet did not kill him outright. He was carried, still breathing, to a nearby hospital. For a few hours, doctors fought to save him, but the wound was beyond healing. By the end of the day, Joachim of Prussia was gone. He was 29 years old. News of the suicide spread quickly. In Potsdam, whispers turned to shock. In Berlin, newspapers printed headlines heavy with tragedy and irony. The son of an emperor, undone not by enemies on the battlefield, but by despair within his own walls. Across Europe, commentators seized on the symbolism. Joachim was described as the first great casualty of Germany's transition, not a victim of shells or bullets in war, but of the unbearable weight of peace. The image was haunting. The prince who had grown up under the shadow of military discipline, who had marched in parades as the embodiment of loyalty, had ended his life with the same weapon he had once been trained to wield in service of empire. The pistol that symbolized authority became the tool of final surrender. For his family, the shock was compounded by distance. His father, Wilhelm II, was still in exile in Holland. The abdicated Kaiser received the news with bitterness and grief, reportedly blaming the Republic for his son's death. To him, Joachim was not merely a victim of depression, but a casualty of betrayal, of a Germany that had turned its back on the monarchy, Yet for all the emperor's words, Joachim's suffering had been silent, his cries unheard. The funeral arrangements carried a strange irony. A son of the Hohenzollerns was buried with ceremony, but the grandeur of empire was gone. No crowds lined the streets, no empire mourned. The service was modest, attended by family, a handful of loyalists, and those who still clung to the fading memory of Imperial Germany. To the Republic, Joachim's death was not a national tragedy, but the quiet end of a relic. And yet, for those who knew him, the gunshot was not only the end of a man, but the sound of history closing a chapter. Joachim represented all that had been fragile in the old world. The dependence on titles, the crushing weight of duty, the inability to adapt and when the ground shifted beneath his feet. His death was not an isolated act, but the echo of a dynasty collapsing. In the silence after the gunshot, a grim truth remained. Princes could bleed, just like soldiers. Dynasties could crumble, just like armies. And despair could claim even those who had been raised to believe themselves eternal. The residence in Potsdam, once a place of ritual and ceremony, became instead a mausoleum of memory. Visitors who passed through in later years spoke of the lingering heaviness, the sense that the walls themselves carried the sound of that fatal shot. It was as though history had carved the moment into the very stone. The tragedy of Joachim's suicide was not only that it ended a life too young, but that it symbolized the end of an entire world. He had been raised in uniforms, trained for a throne that never came, and burdened with ideals that disintegrated before his eyes. On that July morning, the despair became unbearable, and the gunshot became his only escape. But in the stillness that followed, the question remained, one that still echoes a century later. How could a prince who had once seemed to possess everything end in such lonely defeat? When word of Prince Joachim's death reached Berlin on July 18, 1920, it spread like a chill through a nation already unsteady on its feet. The Weimar Republic, barely 2 years old, was still fragile, scarred by revolution, political violence, and economic collapse. To many Germans, the suicide of the Kaiser's youngest son was less a private tragedy than another symbol of a world disintegrating. Newspapers rushed to print the news. The headlines varied, some mournful, some mocking, some detached, but all carried a sense of astonishment. Suicide among royals was rare, and for a Hohenzollern to die this way felt unprecedented. The Berliner Tageblatt called him a victim of the new Germany. The Vossische Zeitung described him as a man who could not adapt. Foreign papers were even more blunt. The Times of London reported the death with a tone of grim inevitability, as though Joachim's despair had been written the day his father abdicated. The funeral, held in Potsdam, revealed the awkward place the Hohenzollerns now occupied. Only 2 years earlier, their ceremonies had been national spectacles. Crowds lined the streets, bands played martial hymns, and the empire wrapped itself in banners of black and white. In 1920, things were different. The procession was small, the crowd sparse, the atmosphere muted. For many citizens of the Republic, Joachim's death stirred no loyalty, only indifference, or worse, bitter satisfaction that one more relic of monarchy had been swept aside. Still, those who attended could not help but feel the weight of history. The casket, draped not in imperial banners but in plain cloth, seemed to embody the fall of a dynasty. A few loyalists wept openly. Some whispered that the young prince had been abandoned by fate, by family, by country. But the Republic did not stop to mourn him. Political assassinations, uprisings, and economic turmoil filled the headlines within days, pushing Joachim's story to the margins. For his family, the aftershock was more personal. In Doorn, the Dutch estate where Wilhelm II lived in bitter exile, the news struck like a thunderbolt. The former Kaiser blamed everyone but himself, the republic that had toppled him, the enemies who had humiliated Germany, the cruelty of a world that no longer revered monarchs. He could not accept that his own rigidity, the same rigidity he had instilled in his children, had played a role in breaking Joachim. His letters from this period seethe with anger, but rarely with reflection. Marie Auguste of Anhalt, Joachim's estranged wife, faced a different grief. Their marriage had collapsed into hostility, and she had sought independence through divorce. Yet his death left her branded in the press as the woman who had abandoned a broken man. She was forced to navigate the difficult role of widow and outsider at the same time. Their son, Karl Franz, was not yet 5 years old when his father died. He would grow up without the presence of a man whose fragility had defined his final years. The aristocracy across Europe, watching from their own precarious thrones, took note. Joachim's suicide was whispered about in palaces and drawing rooms. A cautionary tale of what could happen when a dynasty collapsed and left its youngest members stranded between past and present. To royals in exile, it was a mirror of their own anxieties. To those still on thrones, it was a reminder of their own vulnerability. For historians, Joachim's death has remained a subject of fascination. Some see him as a man undone by personal weakness, unable to withstand the pressures of a changing world. Others view him as a tragic emblem of a generation shattered by war and revolution, men who had been raised for one order and then abandoned in another. His depression, interpreted now through modern psychology, seems less like individual fragility and more like the natural result of relentless pressures, impossible expectations, and historical collapse. In the streets of Germany, however, ordinary people soon forgot. They had their own tragedies to endure: hyperinflation, political assassinations, hunger. Joachim's name faded into memory, his funeral replaced in headlines by the next crisis. He became, in a sense, invisible, another casualty in a time when death and despair were everywhere. And yet, in quiet corners, the aftershock lingered. To those who had known him, Joachim's death was not simply the loss of a man, but the loss of a certain innocence. He had been the youngest son of the empire, the boy who had grown up in uniforms, who had marched in parades, who had once seemed to embody the continuity of a dynasty. His suicide shattered the illusion that royal blood could shield against despair. The palace in Potsdam where he died became, for a time, a place of whispers. Visitors spoke of the silence that hung in its halls, as though the gunshot had left an echo that could not be erased. Some servants left, unable to endure the memories. Others stayed, carrying the weight of having witnessed the end of a prince. The tragedy of Joachim's aftershock was its duality. Publicly, it faded quickly, absorbed by the chaos of the Weimar years. Privately, it lingered, in the bitterness of his father, in the unease of his wife, in the absence felt by his son. For those few who remembered, Joachim's death was not a footnote, but a haunting, the sound of a gunshot in Potsdam, reverberating long after the body had been buried. And so the aftershock was not measured in days or weeks, but in silences. The silence of newspapers that moved on, the silence of a dynasty that refused to confront its failures, and the silence of a young boy growing up without a father. History marched forward. But for Joachim, time had stopped on that July morning. Prince Joachim's life ended in silence, but his story lingers as more than a tale of royal decline. It is the story of a young man crushed by forces greater than himself. by a dynasty that demanded perfection, by a war that shattered illusions, by a republic that had no place for him. Joachim was not simply a prince who failed to adapt. He was a human being caught between two worlds, raised for one that vanished before his eyes and unprepared for the one that replaced it. His tragedy reminds us that depression does not discriminate between palace and village. Behind uniforms and titles, Joachim carried the same fragile heart as any man. The gunshot in Potsdam was not only the end of an empire's son, but the echo of countless others broken by war, humiliation, and the loneliness of despair. Yet in remembering him, we can choose compassion over judgment. Instead of seeing only weakness, we can see the weight he bore, the silence he endured, the tenderness he longed to offer his child. His legacy is not in power or victory, but in the vulnerability that makes him profoundly human. History often forgets those who collapse in silence. To recall Joachim is to honor all who carry invisible burdens, all who feel crushed by expectations they cannot meet. His story urges us to listen more closely, to notice more gently, and to remember that behind every mask of strength may lie a soul struggling to endure.